I would now like to welcome Professor Eric Jones. He is director of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Europe. He previously taught at Johns Hopkins SAIS as Professor of European Studies and International Political Economy and has written several books on European politics and economics. His full bio is on our website. We are delighted to welcome you today, Professor Jones, and very much look forward to your remarks. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for your attention on this particular topic. Since, in case you read the newspapers yesterday, you'll know that the transatlantic economic relationship is back in the news, and therefore important for us to keep talking about. You will hear from my accent that I do not come from Europe. But one thing I should say, I moved to Europe in 1988 and have been living across the European continent ever since, right? So as much as I talk like an American, I actually have been embedded in Europe and try to understand both sides of the Atlantic as best I can. So what I'm going to try to do in the next few minutes is give you a sense of what's going on in the transatlantic economy from the perspective of somebody who's been following this for a long time and who has a vested stake in this whole enterprise, because my pension from Johns Hopkins is located in the United States and my kids are all living in Europe. So this economy has to hang together or my family is going to suffer the consequences. Now, the basic argument that I want to make, because I'm an academic, is very abstract. But I think it's actually quite important for all of us to appreciate. You see, what we're seeing, both in the global economy and in the transatlantic relationship, is a very slow-moving transformation that started a long time ago and that shows no sign of stopping. And that transformation results in part from the way we, and when I say we, I mean all of us, so both Europeans and Americans, misunderstood globalization, and in part the way we misused globalization. And both the misunderstanding and the misuse have deep roots as well. Now, when I say misunderstanding, I should say I'm a principal part of that misunderstanding because I taught economics and politics in the transatlantic context for 20 years at the School of Advanced International Studies, and a lot of the things that we were teaching were seriously incomplete in the way they portrayed the functioning of the transatlantic and the global economy. And most important, the transformation that we're witnessing right now in the global economy and in the transatlantic relationship has been gaining momentum. Now, that momentum is not in international politics. It's actually momentum in domestic politics. It's a domestic momentum of transformation that's been gaining both sides of the Atlantic, and it will be very hard for the transatlantic partners to change course unless they master this political dynamic. And that's something that we're going to have to do together, right? Now, I'm sure this was not the argument you were expecting me to make as I came up and talked about the future-looking impact of this trade war that we're in right now, and I'll be happy to answer questions on that. I'm also an avid ECB watcher and Fed watcher, and the ECB has got an important meeting next week, so or 2 weeks from now, so I think we can talk about a lot of things, but I think this argument as background is critical for all of us to appreciate. Now, what I'm going to do is break up the conversation in terms of 5 points that will help this very abstract argument become much more concrete. And the way I'm going to make it more concrete is I'm going to flesh out a bit the historical perspective. I'll give you a sense of what it means to misunderstand globalization. I'll talk a bit about what it means to misuse globalization, and we'll see that misuse is really in the eye of the beholder in many respects. I'll explain how that penetrated into domestic politics and how that domestic politics is playing out right now in terms of the way we think about international economics. And since all of you are politicians, I hope that you will come back and challenge me a bit about my domestic political diagnosis, because I'm very pessimistic and I need your optimism to help me push this in the right direction. Now, I know that I'm being interpreted by skilled professionals, and I've given them my notes in advance, but unfortunately, I trained in Dallas as a high school debater to speak at 150 words a minute. So if I start to speak too fast, right, I'll try to slow down. And that way, I won't lose anybody along the way. But I get excited when I talk about this stuff, and when I get excited, it's hard to control the pace of delivery. So let's do the historical bit first. We are living in very difficult and challenging times. But let's be honest with ourselves. The difficulties and the challenges that we face right now are precedented. As a matter of fact, if we go back in time, we will find that there were many worse things happening. I just mentioned that I was from Dallas. Let's not forget that political assassination was very common in the United States in the 1960s. It is much less common in the United States today, and I count that to be a blessing. Violent conflict has been common, but the threat of nuclear annihilation was much more present in the 50s and 60s than it is right now. We even had a defense doctrine that was predicated on massive retaliation and therefore brinkmanship. That was terrifying in many respects, and we've somehow walked that back. We've had lots of violent conflict over the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. I live in Italy, where domestic terrorism was horrific in the 1970s, and we see no domestic terrorism right now. So in that sense, I think that there are many things that we should be glad about the current situation, even if we note that the current situation is very challenging. And it's challenging even in the context of the global economic and financial crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, the European political turmoil that surrounded Brexit, which I've thrown in for our British colleagues just to let them know that we still remember. And with this historical perspective, I want you to realize that things are very much the same in the same old way, but fundamentally they are also different. And it is that difference that I would underscore. And to make the difference credible, I throw out all of this perspective because I'm not saying we live in a completely different world. I'm saying we live in the outcome of a set of long-lasting, nonlinear dynamics, slow-moving, small changes that started decades ago and that now have led us to a very different place. Let me explain what that means. And what we're going to do is start by talking about what we misunderstood about globalization. Now, I spent enough time teaching international trade theory to people who don't know math to explain that free trade is good for everyone because the rising tide lifts all boats. And that was almost an ideological conviction in the academy. And we had very good models to back that up, that people who knew math could demonstrate, and they would win Nobel Prizes by demonstrating the exceptions to those models, which is what Paul Krugman got his Nobel Prize for, an exception to the model that free trade works for everyone. And I think it's important that what we failed to consider were the distributive consequences, the people who win and lose from free trade, and much more important, the perceptions of people about their wins and losses from free trade. I'm saying that here in Dayton, where the deindustrialization of America actually took place in the early 1980s against the threat of competition from Japan, and the perception that just-in-time delivery as a particular technology for organizing industrial production was widespread. And we had debates across the 1980s about what that meant. And if you look at the city of Dayton right now, it's actually in wonderful shape compared to where it was in that very difficult period that it experienced. And these perceptions were not built into our models. So when people lost faith in the way the world economy works, we didn't plan for that. I think that's an important thing to say. We also failed to understand that our economic models had not adapted from the late 19th century to the early 21st century. I mean, I'm sure everyone in this room has heard the argument that a country is uncompetitive because it runs a current account or trade deficit. But the reality is that that assumes that goods markets clear first and money accommodates. We all know that financial markets are much larger than goods markets. They're much more impactful than goods markets. And if you stuff an economy full of money, the people who receive that money have to spend it on something. And stuffing an economy full of money is what Germany did to Greece in the early 2000s by buying up Greek sovereign debt and leaving Greeks with lots of money they didn't want, as a consequence of which they bought things. And what you see is that the money flows in, and then with a lag, Greece develops a current account deficit. The same is true for the United States. The United States receives huge amounts of money from the outside world, and Americans use that money that we receive to buy things that they can't show income for from production itself, because it's more money than they get from production, so they buy things from abroad. And these macroeconomic imbalances, the fact that savings and investment is more important than prices of labor and location or taxes in determining who has a current account surplus and deficit, was something we did not take into consideration when we talked about globalization. Or, even more important, the possibility that whole parts of the world would focus forever on running current account surpluses, which meant that they focused forever on a policy of exporting capital into other countries. Accumulating dollar-denominated reserve assets is a form of exporting capital to the United States. And as they accumulated trillions of dollars in these assets, that created problems in the way the global economy functioned that we never thought about in our models. We also didn't think about the fact that not all parts of trade are traded. Think about ports, right? We don't buy and sell ports. We have ports as infrastructure, so we all have to move all the goods in the world through the same ports, using the same shipping companies and the same containerized proprietary technology. And these things become monopolies in the global economy. There's a wonderful book by Peter Goodman called How the World Ran Out of Everything, and it explains how these shared trading infrastructures distort competition globally in ways that we never anticipated, but that showed up in spades after the corona pandemic, and explain why we couldn't get goods for love nor money to move from one place to the next. And equally, we didn't think enough about economic geography. I mean, imagine, the global economy was supposed to be ferociously competitive, and it is. But the competition over who can produce the best plastic injection molding all takes place within the same part of China at the global level. So it's no longer a competition anymore. And the same is true about the processing of critical raw materials. It all takes place in the same geographic space. It's a ferociously competitive market, but we're just not competing in that sense. And that was not built into our understanding of globalization either. Now, these misunderstandings kept coming to the surface. they would come to the surface usually in the form of financial crises. And so we had a big crisis in the early 1990s as the exchange rate mechanism of the European Union exploded over financial speculation that was explained by macroeconomic imbalances and the liquidity that that represented. And that was speculating on all of these different aspects of the way the global economy was meant to work. The same was true when we experienced later in the decade the balance of payments crises in Asia and in Russia. And the response of the Asian governments was not only to put capital controls on, but also to buy a huge amount of dollar-denominated financial assets to use as reserves so that they wouldn't face a balance of payments crisis later. And that only made the global macroeconomic imbalances worse, which is what brings us into the global economic and financial crisis. Now the global economic and financial crisis was a foreplay for what was the European sovereign debt crisis, because the macroeconomic imbalances that we saw at the global level existed within the single currency in the European Union. And when they came unwound, they threatened to tear the European Union's economy apart. And so these things that we misunderstood came back to haunt us in spades, and they continue to haunt us now. If you read Peter Navarro's work, his contribution to Project 2025, you'll see he talks explicitly about macroeconomic imbalances. If you look at the Secretary of the Treasury's commentary, you'll see he acknowledges that as well. So these things are now finally filtering into our understanding of globalization and represent a change in the way we take the global economy for granted. There are things that we misused or took advantage of or thought we were doing a good thing, but maybe we're not. If you look at the Bretton Woods institutions, for example, Europeans and Americans have preserved their privilege as best they can in the voting structures and leadership positions of the Bretton Woods institutions, like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, on the presumption that their guidance of these institutions would be better for the world economy. And I think that that is a powerful presumption to make. But, of course, many other parts of the world disagree. And then, therefore, look to find ways to get out of those institutional arrangements. But if they try to get out or circumvent those institutional arrangements, like the Southeast Asians did in the late 1990s by accumulating these huge foreign exchange reserves, then that just makes the economy work worse at the global level. The same thing could be said about industrial standardization, by which I mean not just product standards, but labor standards, environmental standards, and all the rest. We believe we have the right standards, and I could argue that we do in many respects, and that the rest of the world should adopt those standards. But we shouldn't be surprised that those standards contain values, and the rest of the world disagrees. They disagree with the values, for example. I'll give you an illustration. I suspect, and I'm just going to throw this out there, that at some point during your time here in Dayton, one of you is going to eat chicken, and that chicken will have been treated with chlorine. And the eating of chlorinated chicken in the United States is just accepted as par for the course, but the exportation of chlorinated chicken to Europe is an outrage. And so in that context, I think we have to pay attention to the fact that we may believe in our standards, but the rest of the world may disagree. And the more we try to push those standards through beyond the border trade negotiations, the more the rest of the world is going to be offended. I mean, one of the more interesting aspects of Project 2025 was the rejection of beyond the border trade negotiations, full stop, and the focus on negotiating trade at the border instead. I'm not sure that's necessarily the best approach, but I can understand where it's coming from. And we could talk about financial market infrastructures like dollar clearing and the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications, or SWIFT. The fact of the matter is, we use those institutions to exert leverage on our partners as well as on our adversaries. And the leverage that we use has made people fall out of love with these shared arrangements. SWIFT, many of you probably don't know, is a cooperative, right? So it's like a commie co-op. but it's a commie co-op where the cooperative members are just really rich banks. And what we did was threaten those bank executives with prison if they didn't do what the United States insisted they do in cutting certain banks out of the network. And you can understand that this would disillusion people to a certain extent. And then we could talk about the digital infrastructures. This is a debate you guys all know, I'm sure, about how cloud computing and the storage of data and the regulation of data that's been stored is very important to each of our societies, but in different ways. And more we try to impose our view of what's right, the more people tend to get alienated. And this is something that's been happening for a long time, and it continues to take place. As a matter of fact, when the Europeans talked about strategic autonomy initially, they did so in 2019 in the digital space. They were more concerned with asserting control over digital technology than they were in peace and security per se. Now, again, all of this is about a matter of perspective, but perspectives matter because these perspectives are what inform domestic political debate. And here, I think it's easy to understand how, in domestic political terms, people have lost faith in multilateral institutions and the global economy. We began to see that all the way back in the early 1990s in the debate about NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Association, that took place in the 1992 presidential campaign. But it exploded in force in the battle for Seattle when it seemed as though young people for the first time woke up to the existence of a World Trade Organization and pushed back very hard against the idea that free trade was doing good things for developing countries, and tried to represent developing countries along the way. We've seen the people lose faith in elites like me, who kept arguing that free trade was always a good thing, and experts like me who said, well, you don't know because you haven't studied enough. You don't have a PhD, so how could you really participate in this conversation? And the populism that emerged from that has filtered across society, both in Europe and in the United States. And it's been doing so for a long time. You know, I mentioned Ross Perot, but Ross Perot was a populist who created a third political party with the explicit goal of challenging the policy consensus at the elite level in the United States. And this has had a terrible effect on the way the public perceives the transatlantic economy. Now, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership was the best economic relationship that never came to be. It was the low-hanging fruit identified by a high-level working group on growth and employment, that if we would just simplify regulation and make it more compatible across the Atlantic, if we would just extend the principles of regulatory equivalence in terms of the demonstration of compliance, if nothing else, then think how much more efficient we could make the global economy and the transatlantic economy along the way. And what never was expected in that context was that this would produce popular outrage, both in Europe and in the United States. It wasn't the Trump administration coming in that killed TTIP. TTIP was already dead by that point because there was no popular support and no way to engender popular support for this kind of comprehensive trading agreement. And that's strange, right? That people would pay so much attention to these things. But they had lost so much faith in elites and experts that they had to pay attention because they didn't believe what the elites and experts were saying. We could extend this argument to include the whole European project. Two of my colleagues, Lisbeth Hoge and Gary Marx, have made a closet industry out of the study of what they call post-functionalism. But basically what it is it's people have become more suspicious of European integration and therefore less indulging of elites who try to integrate without explaining how that integration is supposed to take place and what it's going to mean in terms of distributive consequences and all the rest. As a consequence of which, European integration has slowed down to a considerable degree, particularly in terms of institutional reform. And I say this as somebody who's been committed, a lifelong committed paid-up member of that project of trying to make Europe a better, stronger, more effective place. It is much harder today than it was when I started working in Brussels in 1988-89. And it's harder to protect democracy as well. And here, I think the loss of faith in liberal democracy is something that we see in Central and Eastern Europe, but it's not limited to Central and Eastern Europe. It's also present in the United States. And you can see that in the polarization of the debate over whether democratic institutions should be protected or whether they should be respected, right? Because the same debate was taking place with one side saying, no, we have to respect democratic outcomes, and the other side saying, no, we have to protect democratic processes. And in all of this, it's also the global economic infrastructures that have become a focus for political debate at the domestic level. Here, I have to say, I've been very influenced by the experience of Brexit. My good friend and colleague, Anon Menon, traveled across the United Kingdom doing popular town halls, trying to understand why people would reject the European Union, and he kept getting really interesting responses. He would say, European integration increased Britain's gross domestic product. And the people would respond, yeah, maybe that's your GDP, but it's not mine. And so why would I care that that's what the EU represents? Opening the internal market has created all these opportunities for free mobility of labor. And they would say, yeah, and that's precisely the problem. We don't want labor to be freely mobile in that way. And the whole sense in which these fundamental elements, like the single market in the European Union, became politicized was entirely unexpected. And it's true also in the United States. The fact that we would turn our backs on institutions that the United States government created with its European allies at the end of the Second World War to control the global economy, we're turning back on our institutions of leverage is strange until you recognize that in popular political parlance, these institutions are themselves the source of the problem. And this has a huge impact on economics. And this is what makes all of this prologue to the debate that we're having right now, right? You can see it in the challenge to free trade and the World Trade Organization that I mentioned. And I should caution you, the attack on the World Trade Organization really began in the 1990s as an attack on the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It extended into the 2000s in the context of the Doha development round of multilateral trade talks, and it crystallized in the Obama administration's unwillingness to approve the appointment of members of the arbitration committee responsible for arbitrating disputes. And so if the WTO is not functioning, it's a bipartisan consensus that has brought it to this state. And instead, what we've had is the emergence of a whole different way of thinking of the global economy. And here I have to admit, I'm very grateful to Jake Sullivan and to the Biden administration, because they spent the 4 years that they were in the wilderness from 2016 to 2020 developing an articulation of this new way of thinking in the foreign policy for the middle class. It's completely antithetical to the way we used to think about and teach globalization, because it all depended on high walls and small gardens. It depended on de-risking and re-engineering supply chains. It depended on using the tools of industrial policy. And I'm not saying that I'm advocating this. I'm saying that this is a radical break for any administration to advocate. And it wasn't the first Trump administration that crystallized this break. It was the Biden administration. It's not an accusation, it's just a marker of change. And that change is also evident in Europe. I mentioned already the notion of strategic autonomy, but strategic autonomy and de-risking have evolved quite powerfully in the form of the Draghi report and the Letta report, two reports written by Italians. Whenever Europeans get Italians to write reports, you know something is going to happen, right? And in the late 1980s, when they wrote these reports, the Padoa-Schioppa report, the Cecchini report, that transformed the way the European then economic community functions now as a European Union. The Draghi report and the Letta report, I would argue, will have much the same effect. And what's interesting in those reports is how much they depart from the way we think markets are meant to function and why, both in terms of competition and in terms of the role of the state. And that is played out in the Biden administration as well. As a matter of fact, the two sides of the Atlantic were actually in agreement in re-engineering market economics and market policy as a consequence. And I would argue that the Trump administration just represents an exaggerated form of this behavior. That's not to say I'm delighted with these erratic tariff policy announcements. It's only to suggest that they don't come from nowhere. They come as part of a change in the way everyone is thinking about the way the economy functions. They are an extreme form, and we can go into why that is, but that doesn't mean that they are different. And we're going to see this play out not just in terms of tariffs and trade wars, but also in terms of the more aggressive use of sanctions and even embargoes as we weaponize the global economy against our competitors as well as our adversaries. And I think that's a problematic thing for us to do. I also think it's problematic that we're turning back on these infrastructures. I say the abandonment of exorbitant privilege, but if you were an economist like me who follows central banks and financial markets, you would be horrified with the idea that the United States is trying to abdicate the central role of the dollar as a global currency. I can understand the motivation behind that, but if it's not the global currency, then the desire of foreigners to purchase dollar-denominated assets will be diminished, and the cost of U.S. public debt will be increased in very dangerous ways. And along that context, we're going to see an increasing fragmentation of the transatlantic economy. I've put uncertainty and predictability. I think the Trump administration's superpower is its control over uncertainty, its ability to keep confusing us or upending us by changing the rules of the game. The European Union's superpower is its control over predictability. It loves to write rules, to create environments where things are predictable. And these things don't mix together easily. The more unpredictable the United States is, the more Europe will write rules to exclude U.S. industry and to insulate it from U.S. policy, and that will fracture the transatlantic economy in fundamental ways. And you know what? I don't know how to fix this. So I need your help, because I think that the solution is political and not economic. I don't think that the solution is some professor coming out of the wilderness to tell you what you need to do. I think the solution is for you guys to confront the reality of this situation and tell us how we can be of assistance, because you're the only people who can make this change. There's a little further reading if you're interested. Much of what I've said in an argument is already published, but I'm extremely grateful that you chose to be with me and to listen to this when you have such a delicious breakfast waiting in the other room, and I look forward to discussing whatever issues you may choose to raise. Thank you.
For this excellent presentation. Now, I'm going to open the floor for my colleagues to explain how we are going to solve this. And I'm giving the floor first to Bart Kroon from Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Mr. Jones, for this very elaborate speech. And to be honest, the more energy you put in it, the more enthusiastic I got about it. So don't stop ever your pace, don't lower it. It's okay, I appreciate it. The word ESG was not part of your speech, but somewhere in the back it did sound a bit. So could you elaborate a bit on what the impact is of the endless focus of the European Union on ESG standards in global trade?
Well, Bart, thank you so much. I actually wrote my doctoral dissertation on the Dutch economy, and so I know you're in a pickle in terms of nitrogen in the soil, and I know that there are a lot of really difficult challenges in ESG terms that the Netherlands has to face that are unique in many respects, and I think that's the key point. Their ESG challenges are everywhere unique. I think the European Commission has tried to respect that reality, but the problem is that the way the European Commission and the European institutions legislate makes it very difficult to do that, right? And as a consequence, the more they pushed these common standards, the more they ended up alienating everyone in the debate. And so the challenge has been to figure out a way to achieve the goal, perhaps using different instruments. And I think that's where Ursula von der Leyen's commission is right now. So they're advocating simplification alongside colleagues from the European People's Party inside the European Parliament. They're looking for ways to moderate the strict, predictable commitments to specific targets. They're challenging even the nomenclature or the taxonomy that we use in order to understand these issues. But that doesn't mean they're not committed to effective climate action. And this is the point I think we should underscore. We can be more flexible if we have a clear political commitment. And signaling the clarity and conviction behind that commitment is the biggest challenge they face right now. Because if they could signal that more clearly, they would get much more support for the simplification efforts that they have underway. I hope that answers your question.
Now I give the floor to Irma Kalina from Latvia.
Yes. Thank you, Eric, for a fascinating presentation. As you know, in the last 24 hours, we Europeans were hit with incredibly disturbing news of 50% tariff. In your opinion, is there a way, where do we go from here? How do we handle this? How do we improve our transatlantic relationships without losing our pride, without sacrificing our GDP for military industry? And as you probably know, Latvia has hit 5%, along with Estonia, Lithuania, and Poland. And it has come with great sacrifice from our society. And when I go back to Riga, I have to explain to my constituency that the U.S., because I also head the U.S. friendship team and also the Canadian team, how do I explain to our constituency, to our population, that this is happening? And how do we collectively, as Europeans, improve our transatlantic relationships, given the fact that this is a very tenuous time for all of us? Thank you very much.
Well, Irma, thank you. Thank you so much for your question. I mean, the reason that I've been quoting from Project 2025 is that when it became clear that Donald Trump was going to win the election, my immediate concern was to understand the structure of the coalition of economic thought within his administration, because there is a significant part of that coalition that believes in free trade, that believes in recognition of regulatory equivalence, that believes in the smooth and efficient functioning of markets, and that is ready to do business. And that's much more worried about what they describe and what the Biden administration described as the non-market characteristic of China as a threat to global economic competitiveness. So I've been arguing for months now that we need to find those elements in the economic coalition and appeal to them to restructure the conversation. And I, no thanks to me, but I do believe that this is what the European approach has been. to figure out ways to push the conversation toward mutually acceptable agreement. And we came close in the last iteration of the conversation, and the disillusionment that you express comes from the fact that the president has exercised his superpower and introduced this 50% tariff threat for the 1st of June in an effort to nudge the conversation in a different direction. And
on that for one moment, if I may, because time is of essence for us right now, and we're piddling it away. We're piddling it away, and what is happening right now, Mr. Putin is sitting in his bureau right now, smiling ear to ear and saying, this is exactly what we want to weaken Europe. Thank you.
Naeem, I went to Kyiv and met with both members of the government and parts of civil society last November, December, in the immediate aftermath of the Trump election, because we're very committed to helping them in place, both in security terms and in the accession terms. And so I understand the threat that you mentioned, and I'm acutely attuned to it. Unfortunately, from a bargaining perspective, it's very effective to put you under time pressure and to keep changing the rules of the game. And if you think about it as a negotiation, that creates one perspective. If you think about it as an existential threat, it's a very different perspective. I share your perspective. It is an existential threat. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to focus on the existential threat when you're being distracted by the negotiation. I think you're right there. But I say that as an individual. I think what we need to do is to convince key members of the Trump administration and its support community to adopt a different perspective. And I think there has been progress that has been made in that respect. And part of that, as you rightly point out, is associated with the ability of Europe to make commitments to invest in its own security. And Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, the Baltic states, Poland, we have a long list of countries that have made those commitments, and we're just using it to move the needle. But at a certain point, that needle will move. The one thing about the Trump administration, he's not going to blow up the transatlantic economy, my guess. He's not going to blow it up because he has so much to gain from keeping it intact. But then again, I have to say the power of control over uncertainty is that it's pervasive, the sense of uncertainty and helplessness in many respects. So I understand your frustration, and I wish I had a better solution for it.
Thank you very much for a very thought-provoking and sadly confirming some of my fears and prejudices. Just a couple of comments and then a couple of questions. On Brexit, I take it personally because I've been involved in most of the legislation that's been replumbing the country following Brexit. But because I came from a place that voted overwhelmingly for Brexit, I wasn't at all surprised when the vote went. So I campaigned against it, but had a wager, a bet on it actually happening. So I was slightly financially hedged, but that didn't really help on the morning after. You talked about the foreign policy for the middle class, and I couldn't quite tell whether you approved of it, disapproved of it, or I think you could see why they did it, but it would be quite nice to get your judgment on what it is. Then I really wanted to come down on two related things, which is competition policy. Because it was competition policy that drove the concentrations of economic geography on both sides of the Atlantic. First of all, it concentrated within our own countries, and then it concentrated globally into one country, and then it concentrated into one part of that country. And I wondered about your observations of that. And sitting within competition policy is the issue of standards, and this has never been more important than in the digital sphere. And politically, there's, in a sense, I don't think an awareness, certainly from many of the people I talk to, about the absolutely central role of standards and where, in a sense, we've abrogated that entirely to business and to the market. And there's a huge element, particularly within the digital sphere, where if we don't understand what's happening within standards, then we're handing the market to a very small number of players, to an oligopoly somewhere in the west coast of the United States.
Well, I lived for 6 years on a council estate in Nottingham. And for those of you who don't know, Nottingham is not just where the sheriff lived, but it also was the heartland of small and medium-sized enterprises in the East Midlands. So it's a very industrial, very competitive place, and they voted overwhelmingly in favor of Brexit. Which I found astonishing on one hand, because I had been working with a lot of these firms and trying to help them better to understand opportunities that they could have in European markets. But on the other hand, I completely understood. They were not the focus for attention for policymakers in Westminster, so I'm so glad to see that they get more attention today. The foreign policy for the middle class, I have to admit, as somebody who was trained as a macroeconomist and an international economist, I find horrifying because it goes against everything that we believe to be true. But I'm not sure whether I'm horrified about the policy or I'm horrified about the belief set. Because there is a reason for wanting to exercise that kind of policy, and it's all about trying to win support in the popular political debate. And we need that support. So on the one hand, I'm a little bit afraid of the policy. On the other hand, I'm hoping politically that it would work at some point. If not in this electoral cycle, then in the next. At some point, we have to get people to buy into the global economy again, because if we don't get people to buy into the global economy at the domestic political level, then we don't need to keep having this conversation, because they will push the whole debate in a very different direction. The role of competition policy in economic geography is actually a curious one. You see, in the United States and in Europe, we have very different notions of competition and competition policy, which is odd given that the United States played such a role in shaping competition policy in the European context. But we are seeing a convergence, and here I will point to one thing that I found very surprising. The convergence is on buy local provisions. Europeans used to abhor buy local provisions in public procurement because that would distort the functioning of the internal market. In the United States, buy local is a fact of life in public procurement, right? You wouldn't do public procurement if you couldn't do a local preference in your purchases. Now the Europeans are moving toward the introduction of buy local requirements. You saw it in the Draghi report. You see it now in the new SAFE instrument that they created to fund defense procurement, 65% of the value of which must be sourced from within the European marketplace. Now, this is a big change in the way they view competition policy in state aids in the European context, and it's one that I think will disadvantage the transatlantic economy, because it's going to exclude the United States and include others that are more closely associated with Europe. So it's something to watch out for. The conversations about standards, I wish we had more time for, to be honest. I began life working on industrial standards because I was in Brussels working on the completion of the internal market, which was all about industrial standards. And what we have discovered is that industrial standards play an even more important role in firms that benefit from increasing scale returns and network dynamics. And so if you live in the Apple ecosystem, you know what I mean, right? And we don't know how to deal with that, but we will have to figure out a way.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Congressman Dunn.
Thank you very much. You know, a lot of the conversation these days in this trade war is centered on tariffs. And of course, tariffs are very easy to talk about. They're sort of binary, turn them on and off, and it can be very quickly adjusted and measured. But honestly, the difference in tariff burdens to America and Europe were very slight. 6 months ago, 1% to 2% maybe. The real difference was in other trade barriers, whether it's the tax systems, the value-added tax rebates on exported, impositions on importation, and rules, laws written to control, what we can and can't, chlorinated chicken or whatever, that go into Europe. These are the things that actually impose the differences in the trade, if you will, fairness. And that, if you add it all up together, is about 19 to 20%. And so it's not the tariffs really, although that's what we focus on because they're an easy conversation. But to remove these trade barriers, to lower them, is a much more complicated, difficult, lengthy process. And I think that's not the kind of process that perhaps our administration really wants to go through right now. And just changing our tax system. We have a different tax system than almost every other country in the WTO, and it's a big disadvantage to us on that. So I wonder if you agree with that, and if you see any way through that thicket.
Well, Congressman, thank you so much for your question. Non-tariff barriers to trade were exactly the focus for the relaunching of Europe in the late 1980s. So for the first time, they recognized exactly what you're talking about, how differences in industrial standards and regulatory frameworks were distorting the way that markets functioned. And in the European single market, they began systematically to attack those things. And as you say, it was painstaking work. It's still not finished. Unfortunately, new regulations emerge all the time, and then you have to figure out how to factor that into the process. But what's fascinating is that at a certain point in the 1990s, Europe actually overtook the United States as the place within which it was easier to do business across the integrated market. There's a great book by Thomas Philippon, who teaches at NYU, a French economist, but he's trustworthy nonetheless. And he shows how the United States actually became more inhibited by these non-tariff barriers to trade inside the U.S. internal market than the European internal market was. I have a colleague, Craig Parsons, at the University of Oregon, who's been deepening that research systematically, sector by sector, and showing how the European market is much more free-moving than the American is. Now, that's not to say that there can't be progress made in both places, but I would suggest that's going to be painstaking progress that we should do in a compatible way, like we were trying to do with TTIP. Right? And we need to do this in a way that we don't create more problems than we address. At the same time, if you were to look at the macroeconomic data, you would find that the biggest problem in the U.S.-European trading relationship is the fact that after the financial crisis, European financial markets fragmented, and money does not flow easily from one country to the next in Europe. And instead, much of that money flows to the United States. And since Europeans are investing in the United States, European startups are moving to the United States to receive European investment. And that is the macroeconomic imbalance that's creating this huge imbalance in our current account position across the Atlantic. And the way to solve that would be to embrace the Draghi and Letta reports and the agenda they represent. That would cause more investment in Europe by eliminating the tariffs, the non-tariff barriers to trade in finance, by creating what they call the Savings and Investment Union or the Capital Markets Union. And that would make Europe stronger. It would make the transatlantic relationship stronger. And it would reduce a lot of this cross-Atlantic trade pressure. So one of the things that we've been advocating that that we push in the context of this transatlantic dialogue is give the Europeans time credibly to commit to the Draghi and Letta agenda, the competitiveness compass, all the rest, and the U.S. European dynamic will change in ways that are exactly what the Trump administration wants to achieve without the necessity for tariffs.
Thank you, Professor Jones. And we came to the end of this session also. This was a very stimulating and very valuable exchange. So we would like to thank you very much, and to our colleagues also for their contributions to this session. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
See you in Turkey.
Absolutely.